Hello and welcome. I'm Gareth Lloyd, General Manager Corporate Affairs at the Global CCS Institute. I'm delighted to welcome our international audience. We've got attendees on this webinar from around the globe. So just to introduce our topic today, this webinar will provide an overview of CCS in developing countries, and it'll include highlighting project developments, key activities and studies, and storage assessments. It'll give you a very useful context for some webinars that follow, and I'd recommend that you look out for these. They'll be presented by the World Bank on Thursday the 9th of April and the Asian Development Bank on Thursday the 30th of April. So I'd recommend that you attend those webinars if you can do so. So I'm going to kick off now and introduce you to our presenter today, and that's my colleague Alice Gibson. Alice is the Global Institute's Principal Manager for Capacity Development. She develops capacity development programs and manages the delivery of capacity development activities in the Asia-Pacific region. And she does that in close consultation with stakeholders in those countries. She also coordinates our regional collaboration within the Institute on capacity development and manages our strategic relationships with other capacity development providers to make sure that we can deliver CCS projects in terms of capacity development globally. She's got previous experience working for the Australian government, what's now called the Department of Industry, but at the time was Department of Resources, Energy and Tourism. She's held several positions there, including manager of the mine safety section, managing international mine safety capacity development projects. So a warm welcome to Alice, who's going to be our presenter this afternoon. First of all, I want to give you a brief introduction to how the questions work. It's all very simple, and the mark of a good webinar we find is plenty of questions. So I'd encourage you to ask those questions either as we go or at the end of Alice's presentation. I will present the questions to Alice at the end of the presentations, but if you think of a question while we go, all you need to do is find that little questions tab on your GoToWebinar control panel on your screen and type the question in there. I'll moderate them, I'll manage them for you. I will definitely try to get as many questions in as I possibly can, but you'll understand that I can't guarantee that we can answer every question, but we'll try and do a follow-up for you if we're unable to. And that does mean also if I see two questions that are almost the same, I'll probably combine them. So the questions process is very simple. As I say, I encourage you to ask those questions, and if you want to write into the panel as you go and you hear Alice, please do so, otherwise straight after Alice's presentation. So without further ado, I'd like now to hand over to Alice. Thank you.
And I just really wanted to add my welcome to Gareth's welcome to everybody that's joined us on this webinar this afternoon. And without further ado, let's jump into the presentation. This slide obviously is just an overview of my presentation, which will be about 30 to 35 minutes long. And as Gareth said, there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. So please send them through as you think of them. Now, before I launch into the status of CCS in developing countries, I thought that I would just take a moment to start with why we're interested in CCS in developing countries in the first place. Why is that the focus of this webinar series? And I think this diagram is a really useful one to situate that discussion. And I know that some of you have probably seen this diagram before, but it is an excellent reminder of the vital role that CCS will play in a low emissions future. For those of you who are not so familiar with the diagram, the top line estimates emissions out to 2050 if the world follows a business as usual trajectory. And that you can see this will head towards a 6-degree Celsius increase in temperature. The bottom line indicates the global emissions reductions we need to achieve if we want to limit global average temperature rise to no more than 2 degrees. And the different coloured wedges indicate the portfolio of low carbon technologies that will help us achieve that emissions reduction targets. It is important to note that this is a lowest cost pathway modelling based on the International Energy Agency's modelling. And you can see in the dark purple wedge there that CCS is a vital component of this portfolio and will contribute an estimated 14% of emissions reductions overall from 2011 out to 2050, or 17% of emissions reductions in the year 2050. Now, the International Energy Agency also estimates that 70% of this deployment will need to happen in non-OECD countries. So just to underline that, the majority of this deployment will need to happen in developing countries, and that is why we're particularly interested in the status of CCS in developing countries and why the Institute has had a very active capacity development program in developing countries over the last 5 years, and we can continue to work in this space to support the deployment of CCS in developing countries. So just moving on now to an overview of the status of CCS in developing countries, but a few things to note before I launch into that. One is this is an institute assessment of the status of CCS in developing countries, and of course CCS is constantly evolving, so we're very open to feedback if you think that something's been happening in a developing country that we've missed. Another important thing to note is that when I use the term developing countries, I do mean non-Annex 1 countries under the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, with the exception of Korea. And we do that, or we use that definition to be consistent with the international climate change architecture. So I'm introducing this slide, or I'm using this slide to introduce the CCS Development Lifecycle. And this is a bit of a conceptual tool developed by the Institute, just to give you a sense of what some of that capacity development and status of development might be. And you can see that it's got 5 stages of CCS development in that orange bar along the top, starting with scoping opportunity, putting CCS on the policy agenda, creating an enabling environment for CCS, project delivery, and that could be at the smaller scale or the larger scale of project delivery. And the last stage there is multiple large-scale CCS project delivery. And you can see that in those lines underneath on the horizontal, we've really broken out in a little bit more detail what it means those different stages actually mean. Now, I've introduced that in the hope that this diagram will then become a little bit clearer to understand. So this really is CCS, or the status of CCS in developing countries at a glance, and that's why I've included it. You can see down the left-hand side that I've listed developing countries that have CCS activity, and then using that development life cycle across the top of different sort of stages of activity. Now, a blue box represents activity in a relevant space. I do want to emphasize that a blue box doesn't necessarily represent completion of an activity in that space. And you'll see, to take one example, that Malaysia, for instance, has a blue box in the legal and regulatory space. And in fact, that the Institute helped them to do some early work in that, but they by no means have finished or have developed a legal and regulatory framework. So they've started activity, but they haven't completed it. The other thing that I think is worth noting to sort of read this diagram is that project delivery I've limited in this instance to large-scale projects, and I'll touch on that in a little more detail in the next few slides. So looking at the diagram, you can really see that most of the activity is in that early stages, the scoping opportunity and putting CCS on the policy agenda. But there are some notable exceptions, and some countries have sort of moving much more into not only creating the enabling environment, but actually project delivery. And over the course of the presentation, I will touch on the projects, but also major studies or activities that have been undertaken that really represent a lot of the activity that's represented here on this diagram. Now, if you want more information on a particular country that you don't think that I've touched on during my presentation, that's the sort of thing that I'd really encourage you to put into the questions and we can answer at the end. This is actually a different list of countries that I thought that I'd separate out, because really these are countries that have shown early interest in CCS that I thought was worth flagging, because these might be the countries that go on to do more scoping out or enabling work. So they sort of might be future candidates for CCS development. All right, now I'm going to move in the next few slides to talk about projects, both large and small. This slide I'm actually introducing just to give a little bit of, to set a bit of context. You can see here that there are currently 54 large-scale integrated projects in the planning through to the operational projects around the world. By integrated, I mean that they have all three parts of the CCS chain: capture, transport and storage. And by large scale, I mean that the projects are capturing at least 800,000 tonnes of CO2 per annum for a coal-fired power station and at least 400,000 tonnes of CO2 per annum for an industrial facility or a natural gas-powered power station. So this is just context, because what's of more interest in this presentation is what's specifically happening in large-scale projects in developing countries. And you can see here that the current total is about 15 projects, and that represents about 28% of large-scale projects around the world are in developing countries, remembering that I do mean non-Annex 1 countries under that definition. So in Algeria, they host the Insula project, and this is a joint venture between BP, Sonatrach, which is Algeria's oil and gas company, and Statoil from Norway. This project is associated with a gas processing plant, but injects into a saline aquifer, and they have been doing that since 2004. I should note, however, that injection has currently ceased on that project while they decide their future injection strategy. Brazil has an operational offshore enhanced oil and gas project called the Lula Oilfield CCS project, and that's operated by Petrobras. That project utilizes pre-combustion capture and is associated with natural gas processing. And I really think we might see more CCS EOR projects from Brazil as they continue to develop that field into the future. China, you can see from the slide, has 11 large-scale projects in the planning stages, so really emerging as quite a dominant country in the CCS space. Saudi Arabia is currently constructing the Uthmaniyah CO2 EOR demonstration project, and it will use pre-combustion technology retrofitted to a natural gas plant and piped 70 kilometres and injected into the large, or part of the largest oil field on Earth, which is the Gawa field, for an enhanced oil recovery demonstration. The United Arab Emirates is currently constructing the Abu Dhabi CCS project, and that will be the first large-scale CCS project associated with the steel industry, and also linked with an enhanced oil recovery project. Now, the last one I'm going to just touch on there is Malaysia, and I've put that at the bottom because this project currently isn't in the Institute's project database, because it was announced in December 2014, so just a few months ago. But Petronas, which is Malaysia's national oil and gas company, announced that they'll develop the world's first offshore cryogenic distillation CCS project. So it's the world's first, not because it's offshore, but because they're using the cryogenic technology to capture and separate the CO2 out of a natural gas field. And then they plan to inject it into an aquifer, which is located 2.2 kilometres below the seabed for dedicated storage. So our information on that project is all in the public domain at the moment, but we do hope to get further information from Petronas going forward. Now, there are also a number of smaller scale, or what the Institute calls notable projects, because some of them aren't actually that small, that are either in operation or have already been completed. It is important to note that these notable projects are not necessarily full chain projects. There usually is an emphasis either on the capture or storage element. But you can see there that preceding the large-scale Lula project in Brazil, they implemented a smaller scale Miranga CO2 injection pilot project. And you can also see quite a lot of activity in China in operational or even completed capture projects in China. And at the bottom, you'll see that I've included a pilot scale CO2 enhancer recovery project that has been successfully completed by Petro Vietnam and various Japanese partners. Now, I know that not all enhanced oil recovery projects are necessarily CCS projects, but I thought it was worth including this one because the project proponents are cognizant of the potential for CCS EOR to reduce emissions if industrial sources of CO2 are utilised. So I thought it was noting that this might be Vietnam's first CCS-related project, and that might be of interest given the topic today. Now, there are at least 3 developing countries that we know of that have pilot projects, CCS pilot projects in the pipeline. So I thought that they were also worth touching on. Starting here with Indonesia, the feasibility study for what's called the Gundi project in Java has recently been completed by the Bandung Institute of Technology. Now, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, or JICA, have committed further funding for project costs, for actual implementation costs, which will be predominantly focused for the monitoring, measurement and verification requirements of the project. And the ADB, or the Asian Development Bank, is also investigating providing further funding for that project, although there is a number of approval stages that they need to go through yet. So assuming the project funding can be secured, the Gundi project plans on utilising CO2 captured from a Pertamina gas processing plant. That gas processing plant processes gas from a number of surrounding fields that have quite high CO2 content. So they already capture and separate out the CO2 and currently vent it. But during the pilot phase of this project, the plan is to compress some of that CO2 instead of venting it, put it in a truck and inject it into a depleted gas field for injection and monitoring. Now, I believe the plan is to capture about 30 tonnes a day for the pilot project, but don't quote me on that. And there is significant scale-up opportunity for this project to take it from a pilot scale to a larger scale project. Now, Mexico has a policy for utilising CO2 from their power plants, particularly their natural gas power plants, and utilising it for enhanced oil recovery in their depleting oil and gas fields on a commercial scale. So then their national oil and gas company, Pemex, already has a pilot scale project utilising CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. But in addition, their national power company, the Federal Electricity Commission, is seeking to implement a 2 to 20 megawatt equivalent capture project using post-combustion technology on one of their natural gas power plants. And they're currently seeking funding, their power company is currently seeking funding from the World Bank for that project. And that's currently making its way through the approval process. South Africa is also working towards an injection pilot scale project, which they hope will be start injection by 2017. And they are also seeking funding from the World Bank, and that's going through the various approval processes. So that really wraps up sort of the status on sort of large and small projects. Next, I'm going to talk about a few of the notable activities and studies that have been undertaken and represent some of that activity in the scoping out sort of opportunities on that diagram I showed you at the start. And starting with storage assessments, because I think many of you that are listening in are probably already aware of the importance of undertaking storage assessments as early as possible and as a fundamental part of CCS if it's going to be an emissions reduction strategy. Now, it's very encouraging that there are some countries, developing countries, that have already undertaken high-level national storage assessments, and these are based on desktop studies with information already available. The Brazil Atlas has been prepared by an organisation called CPAC with support from the Institute, and that atlas will actually be launched at a CO2 conference in Brazil next month. Mexico has produced a National Carbon Storage Atlas that was published in 2012 as part of the North American Carbon Atlas Partnership along with the USA and Canada. Mexico is actually undertaking further assessment in 2 prospective basins in the northeastern part of the country. So they're really moving their way up through that storage assessment pyramid, if you like, starting with the country level assessment and moving up to basin level assessments. South Africa produced a high-level atlas in 2010 as part of their CCS roadmap. So in fact, they were one of the first batch of countries, both developed or developing countries, to do so. And so I think they really need to be congratulated for that. South Africa is also undertaking further storage studies in 2 prospective basins to identify where their injection project should be located. Now, the other dot points on this slide relate to a regional storage program being undertaken by the Coordinating Committee for Geoscience Programs in East and Southeast Asia, or CCOP. Now, you can see there on the slide that a key goal of the program is to develop a regional CO2 storage atlas and also storage capacity and potential for CO2 EOR in the region, and EOR means enhanced oil recovery. But another key goal of the program is actually to develop capacity around storage assessment and monitoring, measurement and verification in the geoscientists in participating countries. So far, the program has run 9 workshops around the region, and more are planned over the next couple of years. And these are usually 2-day workshops associated with a site visit that have international experts from around the world. So it is quite a comprehensive capacity development storage program. And that's why I've included on that at-a-glance table sort of developing capacity around some of these countries that are actively involved, including some interesting ones that you might not thought of, like Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Philippines, etc. So moving on to the next slide, both the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank have dedicated CCS trust funds, of which the Institute was actually a founding donor to both. And I think it's worth mentioning that the United Kingdom is also a donor to both, and the Norwegian government is a donor to the World Bank Trust Fund. Studies funded through these CCS trust funds in the countries listed on this slide have been important drivers of CCS activities in a number of developing countries. And you would have heard me talk about in the project slides that both the ADB and the World Bank are starting to move towards support for pilot scale projects in Indonesia and China in the case of the ADB, and Mexico and South Africa in the case of the World Bank. However, to date, the 2 development banks have focused on what are essentially scoping studies in a number of countries around the world. And I know it's quite broad brush to call them scoping studies, because the studies that I've undertaken have all been quite specific and targeted the interest and situation within that specific country. That said, I think for our purposes today, it's fair to say that the studies have usually included some sort of capture technology analysis, a desktop storage assessment to various degrees of detail, some sort of cost assessment, and a number of the studies also include a legal and regulatory review, again, to varying levels of detail. Usually they've also included capacity development workshops and study tours and other associated capacity development activities. So as Gareth said at the introduction, we're certainly lucky enough to have the ADB and the World Bank presenting on the next webinars in this series. So I encourage you to listen in to those webinars and ask them directly about their work in these developing countries. Having said that, if you have a burning question, I'll certainly do my best to answer them. So just diving into a bit more detail on some particular countries that have been quite active in the CCS space. And I think you'd all agree that China is really emerging as one of the countries with a lot of CCS activity. You can see from the slide that China has strong policy support for CCS, and CCS is recognised as part of China's low emission strategies really in all their major relevant policy documents, including their national 13th five-year plan. And this recognition at that high-level policy level really paves the way for CCS support for large-scale projects and CCS research and development. In addition, they will be introducing their emissions trading scheme in 2016, which should also help to provide at least some financial viability to CCS projects going forward. Now, a number of Chinese companies have invested their own funds into CCS projects. Like the US, the Chinese are interested in utilising CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, and that's actually a major driver for the oil and gas companies in China. Nevertheless, the Chinese government has provided direct funding support for some large-scale projects, such as the Yangcheng project and the GreenGen project. And you'll see there that there's quite a lot of support for R&D for CCS. Now, these aren't dedicated CCS R&D programs. They're broader R&D programs that have CCS projects as part of the broader program. Given Mexico's strong policy support for CCS, I thought it was worth actually touching on Mexico in a little more detail, because I think that they could potentially emerge as a key CCS player in the future. And you can see on the slide there that Mexico's preeminent climate change policy, their special program on climate change, formally recognises CCS as one of their mitigations, both in the power and the oil and gas sectors. And underpinning that policy is their CCUS technology roadmap in Mexico, which identifies 5 key stages really supporting scale up from pilot scale to commercial scale, and associated supporting activities like legal and regulatory development and an active capacity development program. And I'm certainly pleased the Institute has facilitated their capacity development program since 2011. And we will continue to do so. You heard earlier in the presentation that South Africa is working towards a pilot scale injection project, but underpinning that has been quite a lot of work over the past decade. I think it's interesting to note that South Africa's National Climate Change Response Policy, which was endorsed by their cabinet in 2012, identifies CCS as one of South Africa's 8 near-term priority flagship programs. And you can see that they were one of the early countries to really develop a CCS roadmap. It is a very high-level roadmap, but nevertheless has sort of directed activity in South Africa over the last, almost decade. And there are a number of supporting activities that have sort of associated with that injection project, like for instance work around public engagement and further legal and regulatory analysis. We already heard that there's 2 large-scale projects being currently constructed in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. But in addition to that, the Middle East, including Qatar there, has quite a bit of R&D around CCS, not only at the technology end, but including some on economics and legal and regulatory aspects. I thought that it was particularly interesting that Qatar has established a carbonates and carbon storage research centre with $70 million over 10 years for research, which is a partnership between Shell, Qatar Petroleum, Qatar Science and Technology Park and the Imperial College of London. We've heard about Brazil's large-scale project, but they also have an active capacity development program over the last few years. And interestingly, Brazil's coal industry is also investing in CCS research to develop that as a low emissions option for their coal industry. And to facilitate this development, the coal industry have established a $6.5 million US dollar Clean Coal Technology Centre, and that includes a dedicated CCUS lab. Trinidad and Tobago is actively looking at CCS as part of their low emissions strategy, and in 2013 they commissioned a CCS scoping study, and the Institute also prepared for them a legal and regulatory review, which gives them some really good intelligence to go forward with their CCS development. And stakeholders from the oil and gas industry in Venezuela are also interested in CCS as a low emissions technology in that sector. And the Institute actually ran a series of webinars for them in 2014. Now, I'm not sure if they're taking that forward at the moment, given some of the political situation there, but certainly some early interest displayed. Now, coming to my final slide, I thought that it was worth mentioning that a number of perhaps unexpected countries have identified CCS as part of their technology needs assessment. Now, what is a technology needs assessment, you might be asking? Well, you can see there at the top of the slide, it is a set of country-driven activities that identify and determine the mitigation and adaptation technology priorities of developing country parties under the auspices of the UNFCCC. So on this slide, I've listed the countries that the Institute is at least aware of that have identified CCS in their technology needs assessment. So I think it's very encouraging that CCS is being considered. However, as you can see from my list there, most countries have considered it in passing or not considered it as the main priority. But I think Thailand and Morocco might be notable exceptions to this. Thailand recognise that while they don't have a good understanding or knowledge of CCS at the moment, they think it's a high priority technology. And their needs assessment seems to have a reasonably good list of actions that should be undertaken to develop their CCS capacity, assuming they get financial support. Morocco also identifies CCS as a technology that could deliver significant emissions reductions, and they actually identify that a pilot plant associated with a solar tower to generate electricity for the CCS process would be desirable. Now, I'm not sure of any feasibility studies that have been undertaken for that pilot plant, but the fact that they've identified it, quite a specific sort of idea in their needs assessment is, I think, a good thing, and we might see more development in Morocco. So on that basis, that really brings me to the end of my presentation, and I will hand it back to Gareth as the MC.
Thank you very much, Alice, and it certainly covered a lot of ground. So this is your opportunity to ask questions. So here's a little reminder, just put your questions, whatever they may be, in that little box, and I'll do my best to ask Alice those questions. So just getting us started, there's a kind of general question here. Who's going to pay for CCS in developing countries, and what are the funding mechanisms?
Okay, yes, good question, Gareth. I touched on some of the funding mechanisms that are available to developing countries at the moment, and that's really the World Bank and ADB CCS trust funds are a really good mechanism for funding sort of early activities or pilot scale projects. There are also a number of bilateral or multilateral agreements between developed countries and developing countries where developed countries have supported projects in other countries. And a really good example of this is in South Africa, where Norway and the United Kingdom have provided directly to South Africa funding support for their CCS centre. China has received funding for projects from both the UK and Australia. That's another example. I think I mentioned that JICA from Japan is supporting the pilot project in Indonesia. And of course, the other really important mechanism to keep in mind are the UNFCCC mechanisms. For instance, CCS is specifically eligible for funding under the Green Climate Fund. So when those funds start flowing, that could be a real potential for developing countries to get funds for that. And of course, the aim is over time, the cost of CCS will come down. So hopefully it will be more attractive to invest directly by the developing countries themselves, particularly if they have a price on carbon, which some developing countries are introducing, like for instance, China in 2016.
Okay, thanks. And leading on from that, what are the most important strategy needs of developing countries at this stage in their CCS development?
Strategy needs.
I guess some of that is the sort of stages that you've gone through earlier in the presentation.
Yeah, I think I would really refer people back to that CCS at a glance table. And of course, this recording will be available so people can go back and have a look at that table in more detail if they'd like. But it really sets out some of the key steps that developing countries, in fact any country, developed or developing, can really step through on their way to developing a pilot or for project delivery. I would really encourage or the developing countries I engage with, I really do encourage them to think about trying to establish a pilot project around CCS, because a pilot project is a really good way to catalyse a lot of associated enabling activities around, for instance, storage assessment, legal and regulatory development, developing in-country know-how. It's really a really good focal point for developing all the different aspects of CCS at a scale that is hopefully manageable and might be able to be funded through some of those funding mechanisms that I already talked about. So I hope that answers the question.
And another one related, which is from the same person, Jack Parker, I think that's the name. How do we get information on what projects are being considered for funding and by whom? Is that something we can get? Or is it a case of just watching reports and so on?
I think it's probably a case of watching the reports and so on. Obviously, the Institute, I hope you've got a sense from my presentation that the Institute does have a good handle on what's coming, and that's because we are a donor to the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, and the other sort of player in this space is the Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum. So to be honest, I don't know of sort of a single place where you could go for sort of upcoming projects and projects which have got funding, but certainly email the Institute and it will probably be sent to me and I can give it a good sort of overview of what's coming up. And I hope by listening to this presentation you've got a good sense of at least what's coming up in the near future.
Thanks. And are there, well, you were talking about financing, are there CCS trust funds accessible for CCS projects only or also for CCUS projects, asks Thomas.
I think they're available for CCUS, but as long as particularly if the U stands for enhanced oil recovery, that it is CCS enhanced oil recovery project. So there is dedicated monitoring and permanent storage of CO2 as part of the EOR project. It wouldn't be available for just an EOR project. So it needs to be associated with that added step of monitoring the CO2 underground and ensuring that there is permanent storage of some of that CO2 underground. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, and two others which are wrapped together, which are related to funding. One of them may be a bit hard to answer, how much money is left in the CCS trust funds, from Thomas, but also in addition to the Green Fund in the UNFCCC process, are there any other methods to directly assist the development of the technology in developing countries?
In terms of how much money is currently available, so in the World Bank Trust Fund, the existing funding is really already tagged to projects. Having said that, like I said, those projects are still going through the various approval processes. And also, having said that, it doesn't mean that donor countries wouldn't provide further funding, so there might be more funding available in the future. The ADB Trust Fund, there is some funding still available, I think, for projects. And again, the ADB is also, constantly always interested in more funds from donors, which might be forthcoming. Gareth, what was the second part of that question again?
The second one was not as a related question. In addition to the Green Climate Fund that you've just been talking about in the UNFCCC process, are there any other methods to directly assist development of CCS in developing countries? Not specifically. But I would go back to, like I said, the first question, there is potential for bilateral and multilateral agreements between developed countries and developing countries. As another good example of that, the US-China joint announcement on climate change specifically includes development for CCS in China. There's other UNFCCC mechanisms like the GEF, which is another fund that could potentially be used for CCS projects, and CDM credits, Clean Development Mechanism credits. Now, we know that they're at a level that they certainly wouldn't be covering the majority of costs of a full project. So they could be used for supplementary finance or sort of some of the early, feasibility study costs. Yep.
Not the CDM credits there for a project, but some of the GEF funding, for instance, could be used for scoping studies, etc. So I think, however, the whole point of having some of the for instance, those technology needs assessments that I announced, or that I talked about, in my last slide, the point of them is to flag where countries' interests lies, and which gives them other donor countries, and if they're interested in those kind of projects, they can match up with a developing country. And it also gives a bit of weight to those developing countries when they do go to, seek, say, green climate funds, that they do so because they've already identified that these are priority projects. So okay. I hope that goes some way to answer the question.
Yeah. And a different question, what's the status of bioenergy, bio-CCS BECCS in developing countries?
Early stages. I I think that I know Brazil is quite interested in BECCS, and Brazil has a very large bioenergy industry, so that's perhaps not unexpected that they could see the link between bioenergy and CCS for BECCS. And I know that they were actually seeking funding through the Jeff, Gareth, do you remember what Jeff stands for under the UNFCCC? It's one of the funding mechanisms under the UNFCCC, and they were seeking funding for a BECCS project, which actually didn't get up in the end, but I think nevertheless shows their interest. I know that there's been the IEA has held a workshop in Indonesia on BECCS, so
it's
very
a case of
early
watching,
interest.
early stages, but some interest.
I think early stages, yep. And
Can you...
where I think we might see action is probably Brazil.
Yep. Can you articulate what you mean by CCS value proposition as per the framework, and does it differ between developed and developing countries?
Yeah, what I mean by that is have countries recognise the value of CCS to their countries as an emissions reduction strategy. For instance, what sort of volume of emissions reductions can CCS deliver? Could it be part of their sort of energy security policy? Because we know that many of the developing countries that are interested in CCS actually often have large indigenous supplies of fossil fuel like coal or oil or gas, and CCS allows them to use that fossil fuel supply at the same time as reducing emissions. So that's part of their value proposition, I guess, the link between their energy security but also climate change reduction targets. So that's kind of what we mean. Have they recognised the value of CCS to their various policies? And no, I don't think it differs between developing countries and developed countries in terms of the concept. Obviously, no. The actual value, like the actual
different stages.
Amount of emissions reductions, depending on what their fossil fuel industry is and etc., will differ between countries.
And just filling in that point that came out of the question on bio-CCS, it's the United Nations Fund Global Environment Facility, Jeff.
That's Jeff, yep. Thanks, Gareth.
Alrighty, is CCS for natural gas systems an important issue for developing countries?
I think the answer to that is yes, and certainly the Institute thinks that CCS associated with natural gas is really going to bring that emissions reductions from natural gas down to a very low amount. I know many developing countries see the switch to natural gas already as a kind of a climate change step, because the emissions from natural gas is smaller than, say, coal. But adding it with CCS really brings it down to a very low emissions amount, really only a few percentage from a project. And we are seeing some interest in that in developing countries. I think I mentioned Mexico is particularly interested in applying CCS to their natural gas plants because they have a number of them. There's at least one project in China, notable, so smaller scale project in China, which is a capture project associated with a natural gas plant. So at least, and in fact, the ADB is very soon going to be releasing a report on CCS associated with natural gas in China. So I think that there's a little bit of interest in that even from developing countries even now, but obviously as time goes on and we might see more interest in that because of the opportunity to really reduce emissions even from a natural gas-fired plant quite significantly.
So what's the Institute's recommendation to accelerate CCS or CCUS project activities in developing nations and countries like India getting engaged?
I guess we do that. There's a number of ways that even the Institute does that, and other partners working in this space. And that's to really engage, at least in the first instance, I think, the relevant policymakers on the need and potential, or at least the potential for CCS in their countries. Now, we do that through having a fairly active engagement in the UNFCCC space, but we also do that sort of direct engagement as well. And the Institute has, at least in the last few years, had engagement with India specifically, and engaging directly with their government on trying to raise awareness around CCS and the importance of CCS. And we're not the only ones doing it, either in developing countries widely or in India specifically. I know, for instance, the US and the EU and Norway have also sort of engaging or provided support for workshops, etc., in India to really raise awareness and try and sort of, help them to understand the progress of CCS and to encourage them to think about it as part of their low emissions technology strategies.
I suppose one of the bigger picture points is you could say, shouldn't developing countries just wait until developed countries have implemented and proven and deployed the technology more widely?
Yes, this is the wait and see approach I think you're referring to there, yes. Gareth. And certainly there has been countries that seem to be taking this stance. And I guess to those countries I would note that, well, I'd try and sort of share the knowledge that CCS actually has been proven to work at large scale. It still is in the demonstration phase, but it has been proven. So we're really starting to move past the wait phase. And the drawback with the waiting and seeing is that CCS deployment can have very long lead times. And there are a number of aspects of CCS that really needed to be tested in country and can't just be adopted from developed countries. And a number of those activities include, for instance, the storage assessment. Yep. Every geology is specific to a country. The legal and regulatory development. They can certainly draw on examples internationally, but every legal and regulatory framework is specific to a country. And even that in-country know-how, like even if the technology is available and, it can be bought off the shelf, that countries still need to learn how to utilize that technology in their own country, in their own conditions. A good example of that is, implementing capture technology in Malaysia, where it's very hot and humid. It's going to be very different to implementing it in Canada in Boundary Dam, where it's, very cold. So if developing countries or even developed countries want to be in a position to start benefiting from CCS emissions in 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years' time, they really need to start doing these enabling activities now. And that really mitigates against the wait and see approach.
Okay, and a related question from Craig. Since most of the technology we know is developed in Europe and North America, and the greatest potential is in developing nations, as you've said, what kind of partnerships are required to make the technology transfer happen? And while you think about it, this is probably the last question, and then we'll wrap it up.
I guess we're already seeing some of the partnerships happen to support deployment. I go back to some of those bilateral and multilateral suggestions or examples that I gave earlier. countries can provide funding to the likes of the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, or to initiatives for demonstration in country. Things like the US-China agreement that mentions specifically CCS and has sort of R&D around that specifically targeted, is exactly the sort of thing that we need and that we need to do more of. So I think it's happening. We just need to keep encouraging that sort of thing and doing more of that.
And of course, some of the Institute's work is actually about connecting all of this together to ensure that best practice does actually get shared.
Absolutely. And that's actually, Gareth, that's a really good point. Some of it, for many developing countries, and those particularly perhaps taking that wait and see approach that you mentioned, it is a question of sharing the knowledge that actually CCS, is proven, still in the demonstration phase, still expensive, but is proven, and that there is some really good reasons why they should actually start developing their the enabling activities around CCS now. And it's trying to get that message out, which the Institute tries in many different ways, and including through organisations like the UNFCCC or sort of the events, etc., associated with the UNFCCC.
Okay, look, I'll close the questions there. I think we've nearly answered all of them, so congratulations to Alice for cranking through that. I think we may have missed one or two, but really appreciate your questions because it makes it all a lot more interesting for everyone. So in terms of any further questions, as Alice said, if you do have any and we haven't had a chance to answer them, then send them through our webinar inbox, which is webinar@globalccsinstitute.com. We will, of course, in a couple of days' time, as is usual, provide a recording of this webinar. So if a colleague is particularly interested in participating, well, they can't participate actively, but they can catch up on the webinar. It'll be loaded in a couple of days' time, and that will include a copy of the presentation. So keep an eye on our website and we'll get that done for you. We're always interested in your feedback because we want to make these as effective as they possibly can be, including your ideas for other topics. And don't forget, by the way, that World Bank webinar is coming up on the 9th of April and the ADB seminar on the 30th of April. So as you're leaving the session today in terms of feedback, we've put together a very quick 3-question survey, and we'd appreciate you taking the time to complete it. To help us improve the program for the future. We don't actually provide transcripts, so I'd encourage you to take another listen to the recording if you need to do so, or a colleague needs to do so. I certainly hope you found this session interesting and valuable, and look forward to joining you again on another Institute webinar. So thanks very much for your questions this afternoon and your attendance. Goodbye, and thanks very much indeed. And thank you, Alice.